So I'm Elizabeth Warner, the Director of Development for Ploughshares Fund, and I'm typically one of the people at the back of the room orchestrating events like these. But today, I have an incredible privilege of introducing our next two guests. The first is Michael Crowley. He's the Senior Foreign Affairs Correspondent and National Security Editor for Politico. He's had an extensive career in journalism, reporting from around the world, covering politics and foreign policy for Time, the Boston Globe, the New Republic, and he's contributed to the New York Times, the Atlantic, GQ, and Slate. So please join me in welcoming Michael Crowley as our moderator. And our second guest needs little introduction these days. She is an experienced activist on both disarmament and gender issues. She's a two-time Ploughshares Fund grantee, but way more importantly, the winner of the 2017 Nobel Peace Prize. Beatrice Fihn and the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons won this prestigious award for their extraordinary work drawing attention to the catastrophic humanitarian consequences of nuclear weapons, and for their groundbreaking effort to achieve a UN treaty banning these same weapons. Similar to other treaties banning weapons of mass destruction, chemical, biological weapons, landmines, which, by the way, was another Nobel Peace Prize winning effort that Ploughshares Fund helped support in the early days. The UN treaty that ICANN so fiercely fought for established a global norm against the use of nuclear weapons, and we hope will challenge nuclear states to reconsider their programs. This treaty, approved in July of this year, demonstrates the widespread and growing agreement, especially among younger generations, that we must eliminate these deadly weapons. And many of us in this room have witnessed significant moments in our lifetime where civil society has created pressure for policy change. And right now, with the growing awareness about nuclear threats like we heard about today, we need this kind of vision and inspiration, leadership, and global pressure more than ever. So please join me in welcoming Beatrice Fihn.
Okay,
yes.
I apologize. Hi, everybody. Thanks for the kind introductions. And I'm Michael Crowley. Joe, thank you so much for having me here today. Congratulations to you and Ploughshares. I've known you for a long time, Joe. I think I called you for one of the very first stories I ever wrote in print in the 90s, and instantly realized I had to stay in touch with you because you are a both wise and also very pithy member of the Washington policy community. Never failed to deliver a great insight, end quote. So thank you all. Really looking forward to this conversation, which I'll open up toward the end for some of your questions. I think my mother always hoped that I would win the Nobel Prize. I'm going to have to tell her she will have to settle for me being on stage with a winner and interviewing one. So let's dive into it, Beatrice. Thank you for being here, and congratulations. I think just I can't resist opening by asking you to describe what that incredible moment is like. I have read that you actually didn't believe the phone call you received telling you the news about 3 weeks ago now that you had won the prize, your organization had won the prize.
Well, thank you very much. And thank you, Joe and Ploughshares, for having me here. It's great to be here. Yeah, that was really a remarkable phone call. To get.
First thing in the morning?
Around 11, like 10 minutes before the actual press conference. They don't give you a lot of time. I think also shorter these days with social media and stuff. I think they want to keep it very tight as long as possible. But at first, I didn't think it was a joke. He sounded very Norwegian on the phone. But then, of course, you know, he told me the news, and I just said something very wow, you know, not very eloquent. And then he's like, "Oh, I'm going to put you on hold now because I have to go to the press conference." I was like, "Okay." And then my colleague said, "But are you sure it's really? Are you sure it's? What if it's a prank?" And then I got really like, you know, nervous. I mean, we made some we have some, not enemies, but people that aren't too thrilled about this. I
Critics,
was thinking,
yeah.
critics. Maybe they would just set us up for this. So we had to actually watch the live announcements ourselves before we dared to hug and celebrate. So.
Okay, so it shows you have shrewd political instincts. Trust no one. So why don't we talk a little bit about how you got to that point? And we have limited time, so just very briefly, give us a sense of how you developed a passion for the issue of nuclear disarmament. Then we'll just make sure everyone knows what it was that you won the prize for, and we will talk about the treaty that was adopted by the United Nations. And then I want to talk, I want to be looking forward at where you take this agenda from here and how you leverage this moment of fame that you have achieved. But just briefly, how did you get to that point where this became the consuming issue of your life?
I mean, I think that many people like myself who grew up after the Cold War, nuclear weapons was really not an issue we paid attention to. I studied international relations at university, and we did some classes about nuclear weapons and deterrence theory, but it was like old stuff, not really relevant. I wanted to study human rights, environment, like the real stuff, the important stuff. But then I got involved with an organization that was headquarters in Geneva, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, because I was really interested in gender issues. And they had this disarmament program, and I got involved with the nuclear. And the first time I went into the conference on disarmament as an intern about 11 years ago, I was just really struck by the kind of bizarreness of nuclear weapons. You had these ambassadors from the nuclear armed states talking very dryly about documents, and there was paragraphs, and there was little asterisks there in this one, and you're talking about weapons of mass destruction that can indiscriminately slaughter hundreds of thousands of people in a few seconds, and we're debating over asterisks, and no one is really telling. I remember thinking that everyone sounds like they want to disarm, but they're not. And already then sort of thinking that this is all very hypocritical in a way. And then I just got stuck with this issue.
So you came to it with a fresh set of eyes in a way, and were sort of appalled at this ingrained wisdom in this industry around a reality that you find to be just crazy. And so then what you did was very interesting, because you approached the issue not only kind of seeing it with fresh eyes, but you took an innovative approach towards it, which is to say you rejected these sort of strategic arguments and the kind of arms control game theory that has developed over decades, and you went at it from a humanitarian perspective. Can you tell people sort of what that theory is like, and why you think it was effective, and how it led you to this treaty at the United Nations that we'll talk about in some detail in a minute?
I think we basically looked at the campaign, and I just want to highlight, I didn't win the Nobel Peace Prize. The campaign won the Nobel Peace Prize, and it's this very broad campaign of 460 NGOs all over the world. And some of them are new to this issue, and some of them have campaigned on this issue since 1945, pretty much. So it's like a really wide coalition of people. But I think that what we did together was really, instead of trying to do what has failed to achieve any results for the last 20 years in the multilateral forums, we looked at what has worked. We banned biological weapons, chemical weapons. We banned landmines and cluster munitions. Why aren't we doing what they did instead of doing what has failed to achieve results for about 20 years, at least in the multilateral forums? So I think that, and this is really much based on a sort of a concept of humanitarian disarmament, which started with the landmines treaty in the mid-90s, to look at what the weapons do and what kind of impact it has on people, and make that the starting point for how we should treat the weapon and what solutions we should have to the weapon, rather than what we predict or have a theory about what these weapons would do. So looking at the reality and looking at these weapons as weapons and not as magical power tools that somehow might do things or not.
Right, because we think of biological weapons as sort of demented and insane, and only the most bizarre characters would be manufacturing them in this day and age. But your argument is essentially nuclear weapons should be placed in the same category, and you're trying to shake people out of this this acceptance. Why do you think nuclear weapons have that? We're able to obtain that kind of unique status?
I think we just kind of forgot to treat them as weapons. But also, I think biological weapons were also seen as acceptable. And chemical weapons were also seen as acceptable, and landmines and cluster munitions. And then we worked on stigmatizing them and making them unacceptable in people's minds. And that's when you can also facilitate and work for disarmament. It is very hard to disarm a weapon we all think is absolutely essential for our security and for our survival. So as long as we think that nuclear weapons are essential for our survival, it's going to be very difficult to even advocate for reductions. It's sort of two inconsistent views to keep in mind.
And I gather that a coalition that was working against an international ban on landmines won the Nobel Prize in 1967. So I don't know how much detail you're able to tell us about where that movement went from there, but what happened after the landmine ban movement won that kind of an award? What did it do for the movement, and what is the status of the legal status of landmines internationally today?
I think it was, 1996 they won the Nobel Peace Prize. Just that they had concluded the treaty, very similar to this scenario, really. It has grown. I think it has 170 states on board. It doesn't have states like the US and Russia and China, but it has significantly impacted policies. The Obama administration announced a few years ago that it would comply with the rules of the treaty. It wouldn't sign on to it, but it would comply with an exception of the border between the Koreas. So I think that it really shows that this kind of stigmatizing and pushing this, even without permission from those states, can have a real impact. And that movement then have worked to clear a lot of mines. We see the accidents and victims today have gone down significantly. Production is down. And then channel a lot of that energy into banning the next weapon, cluster munitions. Again, the United States, China, Russia did not participate. It still has had a huge impact. This is quite a new treaty. I think it entered into force in 2010. But still, just last year, Textron, the last American producer of cluster munitions, announced that it would stop producing these weapons, and cited the growing international stigma. So obviously we're thinking that not each situation is different, each weapon is different, each context at the moment where these treaties happen is different, but we think that this can put a lot of pressure on nuclear armed states, on other people, other states, other institutions that uphold the status quo, that somehow are silent supporters of nuclear weapons. It's challenging them. And we're also going to use this to put pressure on the financial industry to stop investing in nuclear weapons production.
So give us the highlights of the effort to pass at the United Nations the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons. It was formally adopted at the UN in July. Tell us tell us about that battle. How long did it take? And what do you think allowed you to push it through in the end?
I think, so ICAN was formed in 2007 with we wanted a treaty that prohibited and eliminated nuclear weapons. But I think the first kind of years of ICAN, the first 3 years, we were sort of trying to figure out how to do that and trying to build support and build agreement amongst ourselves of what we would do. And then we worked with a group of very committed governments in partnership with governments and international organizations like the Red Cross, the United Nations system, and had this plan. I can say it now. We had a plan. The Norwegian government in 2013 organized the first conference on the humanitarian impact of nuclear weapons. And it was an attempt to reframe the discussion around nuclear weapons. How can we make this a humanitarian issue? So they organized this conference. It wasn't a political conference as in having a specific goal, but we would talk about what would happen if a nuclear weapons detonated, or many nuclear weapons detonated. And they had experts, and they quite intentionally did not invite the disarmament and arms control community, and kind of focus on the humanitarians, on those that would help clean up after a nuclear detonation, those that would try to save people, so the emergency relief people, and the UNHCR and the refugee agencies and the World Health Organization, those kind of organizations. And it was a very successful conference and led to a second conference in Mexico in 2014, and then a third conference in Vienna, also trying to explore these issues. And at the Vienna conference in 2014, the Austrian government took a very sort of strong leadership role and said that the conclusions from all of these conferences, who also moved on from just the consequences to look at the risk of intentional detonation, but also accidents, and then also what kind of legal framework do we have around this. So they concluded that we're missing a prohibition on nuclear weapons. Weapons that do this to people, that have these consequences for civilians, should not be legal under international law. So the Austrian government pledged to work for the prohibition of and elimination of nuclear weapons, and other countries rallied around. And in a year ago, pretty much, the UN General Assembly adopted a resolution setting up the negotiations, and here we are.
So this did not happen without opposition from nuclear weapons states, which obviously have a lot of geopolitical influence. And perhaps one highlight of that was when United Nations ambassador, the U.S. ambassador to the United Nations, Nikki Haley, held a press conference outside of the negotiating room during one of the sessions that was underway, in which she said, "There's nothing I want more than a world without nuclear weapons for her children," she said, "believe me. But we have to be realistic. Does anyone think North Korea would ban nuclear weapons?" So, number one, what did you think about the fact that the American United Nations ambassador showed up and actually held a kind of impromptu press conference? I would have predicted the U.S. to essentially try to ignore this effort and sort of dismiss it as not serious, not realistic. But that I thought was interesting. And then, so what was your reaction to that? And then number two, can you talk about her assertion? Does anyone think North Korea would ban nuclear weapons, that this is not realistic?
Yeah, I think my first, just to go back to the Oslo conference, which the 5 nuclear weapon states boycotted, and they sent a joint démarche and went to the Norwegian government and said, "We're not going to this is a distraction and bad, stop this." And I think the first time I really understood that this initiative had real power to it was the reaction from civil society and also the Norwegian government. We had a big civil society forum in connection to that conference, and the Norwegian state secretary was on stage and said that, well, we were démarched by the P5. They were very angry. They said that this was a distraction, we should stop it. And then she said something, well, they weren't very convincing. And the whole audience left. And I think that was the first time I thought, God, we're onto something here. Like, this is immediately the power dynamics change. They are the ones trying to stop things, and we are the ones moving ahead. We are the ones in control in a way. And power is very abstract. And we have given a lot of power to some states, but we can also take that back. So I think that, again, this press conference that Nikki Haley held was sort of a big sign, neon sign, blinking, progress this way, in a way. It's sort of obvious that they understand the power of this, and they dislike that. And it didn't escape us as also the kind of irony of, this process has been extremely inclusive of civil society and academics and experts. So civil society was on the inside negotiating, and the nuclear arms states were outside protesting. It's quite fascinating.
And maybe I'll just elaborate before you respond to her statement with the formal, I think, joint statement by if I have this right, the U.S., Britain, and France after the treaty was adopted, which said that those nations do not intend to sign, ratify, or ever become party to the treaty. They added that it does not address security concerns that continue to make nuclear deterrence necessary and will not enhance international peace and security. Let me just add, by the way, that there are now 50 signatories, 3 of whom have ratified it. You need ultimately 50 ratifications for it to have legal force. Is that right? So the U.S., Britain, and France do not intend to sign, ratify, or ever become party to it. Say it will not enhance international peace and security. Nikki Haley says it's not realistic to think North Korea would ban nuclear weapons. What do you say in response to statements like that?
Well, I think first of all, North Korea should not set the standard for how we think about humanitarian law, international law, and what is acceptable methods of warfare. We have also signed and adhered to the Geneva Conventions, which means that we should not, excessively kill civilians in warfare. And nuclear weapons that's what they're meant to do. They're meant to level entire cities. So I think it's more about, of course, this treaty is not about unilateral disarmament. This is not predicting exactly in how the nuclear weapons will be disarmed. And we understand that will take a long time, that will be a process that you will do together as nuclear armed states. But we have to start with stigmatizing and kind of rejecting nuclear weapons in the way that we've rejected other weapons. And in terms of the statement from 3 democratic countries that they will never do this, it's not up to them. It's up to their people. And we can see that things can change very quickly. And things that we thought was fine suddenly becomes completely different just, a year later. So I think it's obviously, they can't really say that. But at the same time, whether or not they sign it doesn't perhaps always matter. The United States, for example, hasn't ratified the CTBT. I still think that CTBT has been extremely valuable and will be extremely valuable.
The Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty.
Yeah.
I assume many people in this room know that, but just to be sure.
My acronym habits. So I think that signing or not signing, or ratifying or not ratifying, isn't always the deciding factor if this is a success. We see with the landmines treaty, the United States hasn't signed it. It's changed its policy, and that's what matters. So we are going to use this tool, and the more states that sign it, of course, the stronger the norm is going to be and more effective it's going to be. But we're also going to use it in countries that won't sign it right now to put pressure on these countries and change people's minds about nuclear weapons.
So let's talk a little more about that before we take a couple questions. We have a couple more minutes. How do you leverage this moment? And focus, if you would, on the United States and how you can get that conversation moving in the U.S. and be as specific as you can about what you're going to try to do to seize this moment that you have. Just for starters, here you are in Washington. Is there anyone in the current administration who's willing to sit down and talk to you about these issues?
I'm sure they will take meetings if I can get a hold of someone. I've had conversations with Chris Ford, who was here earlier. And he's not a fan of the ban, but always happy to talk, which I think is good. But I think that this treaty and the kind of movement gives us a huge opportunity. And I think that right now, everyone who wants to work for a world without nuclear weapons, we have a huge opportunity here with the crisis between North Korea and the United States, where suddenly people are paying attention to nuclear weapons again. And I think that we have to make a lot of progress right now in educating people, in giving people hope. It's a pretty depressing issue. So I think it's always, when we educate people and talk about the consequences, we also have to provide them with opportunities to act. I think in the United States, I don't know if it's worth trying to get them to sign the treaty right now, but I think we can use the treaty to talk about the humanitarian consequences. What would happen if nuclear weapons were used on the United States by, for example, North Korea or someone else, or Americans? Like if you would totally destroy North Korea, the entire country, with nuclear weapons, what would actually happen? What would the consequences be? And then just also talk about them as real weapons. There's lots of really great initiatives coming in the US right now. No first use policy proposals, restricting the president's ability to launch nuclear weapons. I think all of those are very important and things that we can rally support for and mobilize people. I think that we also have to make this accessible for people who aren't experts and don't know all the acronyms. This is not an issue that is only for policymakers and politicians. This is an issue that we have to push for.
I wish we had more time. We have time for 2 quick questions, I think. So please make them quick. And why don't we start with you and you? So go ahead first.
Thank you, and congratulations. It's on. I'm Dan Smith with the Ploughshares Fund. Did the atmospheric science around nuclear famine, nuclear winter, play a role in supporting the treaty? And do you think that's an argument or a reality that the nuclear weapon states need to take into account in considering accepting the treaty or signing on to it or not?
Absolutely. I think that the nuclear winter study from the 80s and this updated research now on like regional nuclear war between India and Pakistan that shows what climate impact could have. It can have a global cooling effect that would reduce corn and rice crops with over 10% over the next decade, which would lead to huge starvations in many countries that are dependent on rice and corn. I think that really hit the point home for a lot of countries in other parts of the world where nuclear weapons perhaps hadn't been a big issue. We sometimes think this is for Russia, United States, Europe, a little bit of China, North Korea, but it's actually a global issue, just like climate change. What one country does on this issue will impact all of us. So I think it definitely brought the message home for a lot of countries that this will impact us. When they looked at that research, it's like, well, this is not okay. They can't do that to us. So I think it's absolutely been a huge factor in also giving countries in Africa, Latin America, around Asia, a lot of agency to feel that they also have a say in this issue.
Thank you. And one question there, and we'll have to cut it off.
Thanks. Beatrice, thanks so much for being here. I'm Martin Fleck. I'm the Security Program Director at Physicians for Social Responsibility. And I'm so glad that you're here and that you could come. And I want to say thank you so much to Ploughshares for bringing you here, right here to DC. And PSR is a proud partner organization of the International Campaign to Abolish Nuclear Weapons. And I want to challenge my colleagues in other organizations, if you are not a partner organization of ICAN, please become one. But it does seem sometimes as though ICAN and this campaign has been driven by people and groups that are in nations that don't have nuclear weapons, but we're operating in a nation that abundantly does have nuclear weapons. So isn't it key to get the nuclear-armed nations to respond? We're here in the belly of the beast. What's the very best way to bring the ban home to the USA? And does ICAN plan to work within the nuclear-armed countries? Couple questions.
That's your job. No, absolutely. I mean, we work with our partner organizations. We have a lot of partner organizations in the United States, in the UK, in France. For obvious reason, you know, democracy, NGOs in North Korea is not really okay. Russia is very difficult to work with. We have a couple of partner organizations there, but it's also a personal challenge for people to engage in this issue. So we have a lot of work to do to strengthen campaigners and partner organizations around the world, also in challenging countries for civil society. But I think that each partner organization of ICAN knows their context best and where their influence is best used and strengthened. What we want to provide internationally is, of course, opportunities to use this treaty to rally more people and use this Nobel Peace Prize. It's fantastic to see how many people have won the Nobel Peace Prize and how many people are sort of a part of this and feel ownership of this. So I think what we need to do is keep pushing on the humanitarian consequences. I think that's really key to change the perspective on nuclear weapons. I see that very much, that almost the longer you worked on arms control and non-proliferation, the harder it is to understand the ban treaty. It's sort of like this kind of, because it's just a different way of thinking. It's much more Geneva Conventions than it is the NPT or the New START or anything like that. It's not about restricting, preventing, verifying. It's about, aspiration. Like countries that want to get rid of nuclear weapons, that don't want them, will join this treaty. And we will put pressure on the others. So I think this is something we have to develop strategies about, on how to approach nuclear armed states. I already see, we had Jeremy Corbyn in the UK, for example, being very positive about this and using it in his speeches and comments. Lots of more attention in France now as well about this issue. So I think there's a lot of progress that can be made, and we want to make sure that the treaty can be mainstreamed. It's done now. The controversy around it is going to calm down a little bit because now it's finished and it's just there. But they're going to have to relate to it, and they're going to have to answer tough questions from people all the time. Like, the rest of the world thinks that these are unacceptable and illegal. Why are we investing billions in this weapon?
Well, a lot of work for you to do ahead, but you're off to a good start, so congratulations. Thank you so much for this great conversation. Thank you, everybody. Thanks, Joe.